On a July evening in 1974 somewhere, around 9 o'clock, a farmer named Russell Creed started his tractor and drove out to his fields in the dark. His neighbor, Dale Hutchkins, was sitting on his porch a quarter-mile away when he saw the headlights cutting across the Oklahoma night. Dale watched for a few minutes, confused, then called his wife to come look. "What in the world is Russell doing out there? Maybe something broke down. An emergency at 9 o'clock at night." They watched the headlights move slowly across Russell's fields, back and forth, the way a tractor moves when it's working the land, not the fast, purposeful movement of a man dealing with an emergency. The steady, methodical movement of a man doing his regular work, just doing it in the dark. The next morning, Dale drove over to the Creed place to check on his neighbor. He found Russell on his porch, drinking coffee, looking like he'd just woken up. "Russell, you okay? I saw your tractor out there last night. Thought maybe you had some kind of emergency." Russell took a sip of coffee. "No emergency." "Then, what were you doing out there in the dark?" "Irrigating." Dale waited for more explanation. None came. "Irrigating at night." "That's right. Why?" Russell looked at his neighbor with those calm, steady eyes that had seen things in Korea that Dale would never understand, because that's when it works best. Dale went home, more confused than when he'd arrived. That evening, he told the story at the feed store in town. Won by the end of the week. Everyone in Grady County knew that Russell Creed had started farming at night. They thought he'd lost his mind. Let me tell you about Russell Creed, because to understand what he was doing in those fields, you need to understand who he was and what he'd seen. Russell was born in 1929 in the same farmhouse where he still lived in 19. His father, Walter Creed, had worked at Oklahoma land since 1919, surviving the Dust Bowl by the skin of his teeth and a stubbornness that bordered on legendary. Russell grew up knowing two things: how to farm and how to survive. His father taught him the first. The army taught him the second. He enlisted in 1950, 3 days after North Korea crossed the 38th parallel. He was 21 years old, freshly married to a girl named June, and convinced that the war would be over by Christmas. It wasn't. Russell spent 18 months in Korea, most of it in the mountains near the 38th parallel, doing things he never talked about afterward. He came home in 1952 with a Bronze Star, a limp that flared up in cold weather, and a head full of memories he kept locked away. But he also came home with something else, something that would take 22 years to matter. He came home with knowledge. In Korea, between the fighting, Russell had watched the local farmers work their land. Rice paddies, mostly flooded fields that required careful water management. The Korean farmers didn't have the luxury of abundant water like American farmers did. Every drop counted, and Russell noticed something. They irrigated at night. Not always, but often, especially during the hot summer months, when the sun could evaporate water almost as fast as you could pump it onto the fields. The Korean farmers would wait until the sun went down, then flood their paddies in the cool darkness. By morning, the water had soaked into the soil instead of vanishing into the air. Russell asked one of the farmers about it through a translator during a quiet week when the fighting had moved elsewhere. "Why do you water at night?" The old farmer had smiled, his face creased with decades of sun and labor. "Daytime water feeds the sky. Nighttime water feeds the earth." Russell never forgot those words. Now, let me tell you about 1974, because that's when Russell decided to put Korean wisdom to work in Oklahoma. The summer of 1974 was hot. Not Dust Bowl hot, but hot enough to matter. Russell had been farming his 240 acres for 22 years, doing things the same way his father had done them, the same way everyone in Grady County did them. But that summer, watching his irrigation water disappear into the shimmering heat before it could soak into the soil, Russell remembered the old Korean farmer and his nighttime paddies. Daytime water feeds the sky. Nighttime water feeds the fear. Earth. He did some reading, found some agricultural research papers at the library in Oklahoma City, learned that evaporation rates dropped by 50 to 60% after sunset when temperatures fell and humidity rose. Learned that nighttime irrigation could deliver significantly more water to the root zone than daytime irrigation using the same amount of water. The science confirmed what the Korean farmer had known from generations of experience. Russell didn't tell anyone what he was planning. He just started doing it. The first night, he felt foolish, driving a tractor in the dark, working by headlights, doing something that no one else in the county did. The rational part of his brain kept asking what the hell he was doing. But by the end of that first week, Russell could see the difference. The fields he'd irrigated at night were darker, green, healthier, more vigorous than the fields he'd irrigated during the day. The water was going into the ground instead of into the air. The Korean farmer had been right. Russell started irrigating all his fields at night. And that's when the mockery began. Let me tell you about the nicknames, because Russell collected quite a few of them. Vampire Russell was the most popular. The joke was that Russell Creed had been bitten by something in Korea and could no longer tolerate sunlight. People would ask his wife June if she had to sleep in a coffin next to him. They'd wonder aloud if he hung upside down in his barn during the day. The night owl was another, one less cruel maybe, but still mocking. The implication was that Russell had gone a little crazy, touched by the sun, scrambled by the war, not quite right in the head. Dracula of the Plains came from Clyde Osborne, the John Deere dealer in Chickasha. Clyde thought he was hilarious. He'd tell anyone who would listen about Russell Creed and his vampire farming. I tried to sell him a new tractor last spring, Clyde would say at the feed store, enjoying his audience. He asked if it had good headlights. I said, "What do you need headlights for?" He said, "I work at night." I thought he was joking. Turns out he's serious. The man farms in the dark like some kind of creature from a horror movie. The laughter would ripple through the feed store. Good old Russell Creed. Gone completely crazy. Russell heard the jokes. Small towns don't keep secrets, and people weren't particularly trying to hide their amusement. He heard Vampire Russell muttered when he walked into the hardware store. He saw the Siak smirks when he drove past the diner. He didn't explain himself. What was the point? They'd already decided he was crazy. Words weren't going to change their minds. Only results would do that. Now, let me pause here and ask you something. Have you ever known something that you couldn't prove to anyone else? Something you'd learned from experience? Something you'd seen with your own eyes? But something that sounded crazy when you tried to explain it? That's where Russell Creed was in Ann. He knew the nighttime irrigation worked. He could see it in his fields, but he couldn't prove it to anyone who wasn't willing to look, and nobody was willing to look at anything the vampire farmer was doing. So he kept working, kept irrigating at night, kept sleeping, jury, Angie the hottest part of the day, and waking up when the sun went down. June supported him the way she'd supported everything he'd done. Since they got married in 19 cents. They got married in 19 cents. She didn't fully understand why he'd changed his schedule, but she trusted that he had reasons. "People think you've lost your mind," she told him one evening as he was getting ready to head out to the fields. "I know. Does it bother you?" Russell considered the question. "It would bother me if I thought they were right. But they're not right. They just don't know what I know." "And what do you know?" "I know that water evaporates in the heat and soaks in the cold. I know that every gallon I put on those fields at night does more work than 2 gallons in the afternoon." He kissed her on the forehead. "I know that someday something's going to happen that proves I'm not crazy, and when it does, they'll understand what's going to happen." Russell shrugged. "Don't know yet, but something always does." He walked out to his tractor, started the engine, and drove off into the Oklahoma night. Let me tell you about the years between because Russell's farming method evolved over time. By 1976, Russell had refined his approach. He didn't just irrigate at night. He'd restructured his entire operation around the cooler hours. He'd sleep from noon to 6 o'clock in the evening, during the hottest part of the day. Then he'd wake up, eat dinner with June, and head out to the fields around 8 o'clock. He'd work until 2 or 3 in the morning, then come home, sleep for a few more hours, and handle daytime tasks, repairs, paperwork, trips to town during the morning before the heat peaked. It was an unusual schedule, but it worked. His water bills were lower than his neighbors, even though his fields were greener. His yields were slightly better, though not dramatically so. The real advantage of night irrigation was water efficiency, not necessarily product, iron. But in a region where water was never abundant and always expensive, efficiency mattered. The mockery continued, but it became more routine, less sharp. People got used to Vampire, Russell and his strange ways. He became part of the local color, like the old man who claimed to have found gold in the creek, or the woman who kept 17 cats in her farmhouse. Every community has its eccentrics. Russell Creed was Grady County's. What nobody realized, what Russell himself only half suspected, was that his eccentric method was about to become the only thing standing between him disaster. Let me tell you about 1980, because that's when the drought came. The winter of 1980 was dry. Not unusually dry, but dry enough to notice. The spring rains came late and light. By April, farmers were starting to worry. By June, they were praying. July was brutal. Day after day of 100 degrees heat, day after day of cloudless skies, day after day of watching the Coban and corn begin to wither under the relentless Oklahoma sun. Russell watched it happen the way he watched everything, quietly, patiently, without panic. He'd seen drought before. He'd seen his father survive the Dust Bowl. He knew that dry years came and went, and the farmers who survived were the ones who adapted. But this drought was different, because this drought came with something new: water rationing. Let me tell you about the water meeting, because that's where Russell's story took its final turn. In late July 1980, the Grady County Water Authority called a meeting at the community center in Chickasha. Every farmer in the county was there, packed into a room that smelled like sweat and worry. The news was bad. "Gentlemen," said Harold Green, the Water Authority director, "I'm not going to sugarcoat this. The aquifer levels are the lowest. They've been since we started measuring, and the surface water is even worse. If we don't take action now, we won't have enough water to last the summer." A murmur went through the crowd. Farmers looked at each other, doing mental calculations, imagining their crops dying in the fields. Effective immediately, we're implementing emergency water rationing. Every farm in the county will be allocated a specific amount of water per week, based on acreage. You'll have to make it work with what you're given. A hand went up. How much are we talking about? Roughly 60% of normal allocation. For most of you, that means choosing which fields to save and which fields to let go. The murmur became a roar. Farmers shouting questions, demanding answers, arguing with each other about who deserved more water and who could afford less. It was chaos. Russell Creed sat in the back, silent, doing his own calculations. 60% of normal allocation. That meant 60% of the water he was currently using. For most farmers, that would be catastrophic. 60% wasn't enough to keep full fields alive through an Oklahoma summer. But Russell wasn't most farmers. Russell irrigated at night when evaporation was 60% lower, which meant that his 60% allocation would delivered roughly the same amount of water to his crops as his neighbor's full allocation delivered to theirs. The math was simple, and it was devastating. His neighbors were about to watch their fields die while his survived. Let me tell you about August of 1980, because that's when the county finally understood what Russell Creed had been doing. 3 weeks into the water rationing, the county looked like a war zone. Fields that had been green in June were brown in August. Crops that farmers had invested thousands of dollars in seed fertilizer, labor, hope, were withering and dying under the relentless sun. The irrigation systems ran at their maximum, allocation pumping water onto the fields, but most of that water never reached the roots. It evaporated in the bat 100 degrees heat, feeding the sky instead of the earth, just like the Korean farmer had said. Russell's fields were different, not untouched by the drought. Nothing was untouched, but surviving. His corn was stressed, but standing. His cotton was struggling, but producing. His wheat, planted early and irrigated carefully through the spring nights, had already been harvested at near normal yields. People started to notice. Dale Hutchkins, the neighbor who had first seen Russell's headlights cutting through the night 6 years earlier, drove over one August afternoon. He found Russell on his porch drinking iced tea, looking out at fields that were green when everything around them was brown. "Russell," Dale's voice was defeated. "I got to ask you something." "Go ahead." How are your fields still alive? We're all getting the same water allocation. We're all dealing with the same drought, but my crops are dead, and yours are." He gestured at the green fields, unable to find the words. Russell took a sip of tea. "You want the short answer or the long answer?" "I want any answer that makes sense. The short answer is, I irrigate at night." Dale stared at him. "That's it. That's the big secret. You water in the dark. That's it. But how? Does that help? Water is water. It doesn't matter when you put it on." Russell set down his tea and leaned forward. "Dale, when you irrigate at noon when it's 100 degrees out, how much of that water actually gets to your plants?" "I don't know. Most of it." "Try 40%. The rest evaporates before it soaks in. You're spending 60 cents of every water dollar on feeding the sky." Dale's face went pale. 60% at least, maybe more on the hottest days. Russell gestured at his own fields. "When I irrigate at night, when it's 70 degrees and the humidity is up, almost all of that water goes into ground. I'm not using more water than you, Dale. I'm just using it better." "But that..." Dale struggled to process what he was hearing. "What? Why didn't you tell anyone?" Russell smiled slightly. "I tried in a way. I started night farming 6 years ago. You all saw me out there with my headlights. You called me Vampire Russell. You called me crazy. You called me the Dracula of the plains." Dale had the grace to look ashamed. "Would you have listened if I'd tried to explain? Would anyone have believed the crazy vampire farmer if he'd told you that water evaporates in the heat?" Dale was quiet for a long moment. "No, probably not. No, probably not." Russell picked up his tea again. "So I didn't waste my breath. I just kept farming my way, and I figured that someday something would happen that would prove I was right. The drought, and the rationing." Russell looked out at his green fields, surrounded by a county of brown ones. "Everyone's getting 60% of normal water. Everyone's getting 60% of normal water. For you, that means 60% of your crops die. For me, that 60% does the work of 100% because I'm not throwing it away into the afternoon sun." Dale sat down heavily on the porch steps. "I've lost everything, Russell. 300 acres dead. I'll be lucky to pay my loans this year. Forget making a profit." "I'm sorry, Dale. I really am." "Are you? Are you sorry that you're the only one who's going to survive this?" Russell considered the question. "I'm sorry that you're suffering. I'm sorry that everyone's suffering. But no, I'm not sorry that I figured out something that works. I'm not sorry that I kept doing it even when everyone laughed." He paused. "I'd rather be a surviving vampire than a bankrupt normal farmer." Dale couldn't argue with that. "Let me tell you about the feed store, because that's where the public vindication happened." A week after Dale's visit, Russell drove into Chickasha to pick up some supplies. He walked into the feed store. same as he'd done hundreds of times over the years, expecting the you from times over the years, expecting the you, sour smirks and vampire jokes. The store went silent. Every farmer in the place, and there were a dozen of them at least, turned to look at Russell Creed, but they weren't smirking anymore. They were staring at him with something that might have been awe or envy or desperation. Russell, it was Clyde Osborne, the John Deere dealer, the man who'd invented Dracula of the plains. He walked over slowly, all the bluster gone from his voice. "Can I talk to you for a minute?" "Sure." Clyde, outside. They walked out to the parking lot, away from the listening ears. Clyde looked like a man who was about to swallow something bitter. "I heard about your fields. Heard they're still green, while everyone else's are dying." "That's right, Khufu. And I heard it's because you irrigate at night." "That's right, too." Clyde was quiet for a moment, struggling with something. "I owe you an apology, Russell. I've been calling you crazy for 6 years. Vampire Russell, Dracula of the plains. I thought I was funny. You were a little funny." Clyde winced. "I was an ass, and I was wrong." He took a deep breath. "The thing is, Russell, I'm not just a dealer. I've got 400 acres of my own, out past the highway, and they're dying just like everyone else's. I'm sorry to hear that. What I'm asking is it too late? If I started irrigating at night now, would it make a difference?" Russell considered the question. "Honestly, probably not much. The damage is already done for this season. Night irrigation is a long game. It's about building up soil moisture over time, not emergency rescue." Clyde's face fell. "But," Russell continued, "it's not too late for next year. If you start now, learn the method, adjust your schedule, you'll be in much better shape when the next drought comes." "You think there'll be another drought?" "There's always another drought. Question is whether you're ready for it." Clyde nodded slowly. "Would you teach me? I know I've got no right to ask after everything I said, but would you show me how you do it?" Russell looked at the man who'd mocked him for 6 years, who'd turned his farming method into a county-wide joke, who'd called him a vampire and a creature and a lunatic. Then he thought about the old Korean farmer who'd answered his questions all those years ago in a rice paddy on the other side of the world. The farmer hadn't laughed at the ignorant American soldier. He'd shared his knowledge, freely and kindly, because that's what farmers do. "Come out to my place." Saturday night, Russell said. "I'll show you everything." Clyde's eyes widened. "Really? After everything I've Clyde, I'm not interested in revenge. I'm interested in farming. If you want to learn, I'll teach you. If other people want to learn, I'll teach you. If other people want to learn, I'll teach them too." Russell shrugged. "Knowledge isn't worth much if you keep it locked up. It's mean to be shared." He walked back into the feed store, leaving Clyde standing in the parking lot with tears in his eyes. "Let me tell you about the night school, because that's what Russell's farm became." Word spread fast. By Saturday, there were 15 farmers at Russell's place, waiting in the evening darkness to learn how to irrigate at night. The next week, there were 30. By September, Russell was running informal classes every weekend, teaching anyone who wanted to learn. He showed them how to read soil moisture in the dark, using a flashlight and a simple probe. He explained the science of evaporation, how temperature and humidity affected water loss, how to calculate the optimal irrigation timing for different crops. He demonstrated his equipment setup, the modifications he'd made to his irrigation system to make night work easier and safer. And he told them about Korea. "I didn't invent this," Russell said, standing in his field under the stars, surrounded by farm ears who'd once called him crazy. "A Korean rice farmer taught me back in 1951. He'd probably learned it from his father, and his father from his father. This knowledge is hundreds of years old, maybe thousands. I just brought it to Oklahoma." "Why didn't you tell us sooner?" someone asked. The same question Dale had asked. The same question everyone asked. Would you have listened? Nobody answered. They all knew the truth. You called me Vampire Russell. You called me crazy. You laughed at me for 6 years. Russell's voice wasn't angry, just matter of fact. I could have stood on this porch and explained the science until I was blue in the face. And you wouldn't have believed me. You know why? Because I was doing something different. And when someone does something different, the first instinct is to mock them, not to understand them. He looked around at the faces in the darkness, farmers who were scared, farmers who were desperate, farmers who were finally ready to listen because their old ways had failed them. The drought made you ready to learn. The rationing made you ready to change. Without them, you'd still be laughing at me, and I'd still be farming alone in the dark. Russell smiled slightly. Sometimes it takes a disaster to open people's eyes. That's not your fault. It's just how people work. He turned and walked toward his tractor, its headlights cutting through the Oklahoma night. Now, who wants to learn how to irrigate? Let me tell you about the years that followed, because Russell's night school changed Grady County forever. The drought of 1980 lasted through 1981, with relief finally coming in the spring, 1982. By then, nearly half the farmers in the county had switched to night irrigation, at least partially. Some went Allen, restructuring their entire operations the way Russell had. Others adopted a hybrid approach, irrigating during the day when temperatures were mild and switching to nights during the hot months. The results were undeniable. Farmers who'd adopted night irrigation saw their water costs drop by 30 to 40%. Their yields stabilized, no longer yo-yoing between good years and drought years. When the next dry spell came in 1984, a short but intense summer drought, they were ready. Russell Creed became something he'd never expected or wanted to be. Famous agricultural extension agents came from Oklahoma State University to study his methods. Reporters from farm magazines wrote articles about the night farmer of Grady County. Other farmers from other counties, from other states, reached out to learn his techniques. Russell taught everyone who asked. He never charged a fee, never patented his methods, never tried to profit from knowledge. That, as he always reminded people, he'd learned from a Korean farmer who'd learned it, from his ancestors. I'm just passing it along, he'd say. That's what farmers do. June died in 1988, cancer that came fast and left faster. Russell buried her in the family cemetery, behind the farmhouse, next to his parents and grandparents, and he stood alone at her grave for a long time after everyone else had gone home. He thought about all the nights she'd waited up for him, all the dinners she'd kept warm while he worked in the fields, all the years she'd defended him when the whole county thought he was crazy. We did it, June, he said quietly. We proved them wrong. He kept farming until 1995, when his knees finally gave out and he had to admit that 76 years of Oklahoma living had caught up with him. He sold the farm to a young couple from Texas, making sure they understood the night irrigation system and how to use it. The water knows what to do. Russell told them on his last day on the property, your job is just to give it a chance to do it. Put it on when it's cool and it'll find its way to the roots. Put it on when it's hot and it'll vanish into the air. Simple as that. He moved into a small house in Chickasha, close enough to see the fields he'd worked for 50 years, far enough that he didn't have to watch someone else work them. Russell Creed died in 2003. At the age of 84, his funeral was standing room only. Farmers from 3 counties came to pay their respects to the man who taught them how to work in the dark. Let me tell you about the memorial, because that's how the county chose to remember him. In 2005, 2 years after Russell's death, the Grady County Water Authority dedicated a small monument at the entrance to their headquarters in Chickasha. It's a simple stone marker with a bronze plaque that reads in honor of Russell Creed, 1929-2003. The night farmer, he taught us that water belongs in the ground, not in the air. He taught us that wisdom can come from unexpected places, and he taught us that the man everyone calls crazy might be the only one who's right. Below the plaque is a smaller inscription: daytime water feeds the sky, nighttime water feeds the earth. Korean proverb shared by Russell Creed. Every year on the anniversary of Russell's death, farmers gather at the monument for an informal ceremony. They share stories about the night farming, classes, about the drought of 1980, about the man who'd been mocked for 6 years and vindicated for 30. The young farmers, the ones who never met Russell, listen to the stories with something like wonder. It's hard for them to imagine a time when night irrigation was considered crazy, when working after dark made you a vampire instead of a visionary. But the old farmers remember. They remember the jokes and the mockery and the certainty that Russell Creed had lost his mind. They remember the drought and the rationing, and the moment they finally understood what he'd been doing. They remember driving out to his farm in the darkness, humbled and desperate, ready to learn from the man they'd laughed at. We called him Vampire Russell. One old farmer said at the 2010 ceremony, "We thought we were so clever, and the whole time he was trying to teach us something that could save our farms. He just had to wait until we were ready to listen." That's the real lesson of Russell Creed's story. Not that night irrigation works, though it does. Not that water evaporates in the heat, though it does. Not even that unconventional methods can be superior to traditional ones, though they can be. The real lesson is about listening. Russell Creed learned something valuable from a Korean farmer in N. He brought that knowledge home and tried to use it. When people mocked him, he didn't argue. He just kept working, kept proving his method in the only way that mattered, kept waiting for the moment when people would be ready to learn. That moment came with the drought. It came with the rationing. It came when the old ways stopped working, and people had no choice but to try something new. And when it came, Russell was ready not to gloat, not to say "I told you so," but to teach, to share, to pass along knowledge that had traveled from Korea to Oklahoma, from an old rice farmer to a young soldier to a community of struggling farmers who needed it desperately. Daytime water feeds the sky. Nighttime water feeds the earth. Simple words, ancient wisdom, the kind of knowledge that sounds like nonsense until suddenly, one desperate summer, it's the only thing that makes sense. Russell Creed understood that knowledge. He understood that it wasn't enough to be right. You also had to be patient. You had to wait for people to be ready. You had to endure the mockery and the jokes and the certainty that you were crazy. And you had to keep doing what you knew was right night after night after night. They called him Vampire Russell. They called him the Dracula of the plains. They called him crazy and strange and touched by the war. He called himself a farmer, just a farmer who worked at night. And when the drought came and the water ran short and the fields started dying, he was the only one still standing. That's not luck. That's not magic. That's just the reward for listening to wisdom when you hear it, even if it comes from a rice paddy on the other side of the world. Even if no one else understands, even if everyone thinks you're crazy, Russell Creed listened. He learned, he waited, and in the end, they all came to him in the darkness, ready to learn what the vampire farmer had known all along.